The Mishnah is like a zip file, or better still, a Lego kit. Say you're a Lego master and you've built some beautiful structures in Lego that you have strewn all around your living room. And now you'd like to share some of these structures with a friend of yours who lives across the ocean. What's the best way to do that? Well, fill up a box full of Lego and put together a little manual of all the structures that you've made. Put that in the box as well and send that across the ocean. And there, they'll be able to open it up and rebuild the structures that you've designed on this side of the ocean. Same thing with a zip file. If a bunch of data shares a certain set of logical structures to it, the non-structural information of the data can be reduced, zipped, to a bare minimum. And the logical structures can be made into an algorithm that reconstructs the data when it's unzipped. Rabbi Yehuda constructed the Mishnah along the same lines. In fact, the Torah served him as a kind of prototype. Any given statement in the Torah is like a zipped file. By itself, it doesn't tell you much. It doesn't tell you how to apply the halacha in all kinds of different circumstances. The file, the verse, needs to be unzipped. Let's take an example. In the Mishnaic tractate Chulin, we read as follows: every kind of meat is forbidden to be cooked with milk. How do we apply this rule? Is the meat in question just that of kosher animals, or does the rule also apply to non-kosher animals? Are we talking only about kosher mammals, or also kosher birds? And what about the milk? Does it only apply to milk of the same animal, or does it include all types of milk? And does this only apply to milk? What about cheese? What about lasagna, or chicken cacciatore, or a fish chowder? And what about cooking utensils? Can I cook meat in a pot I usually use to warm my morning cafe latte? And are we talking about the act of cooking meat and milk as such, even if we have no intention of eating it? And how is this rule derived from the biblical commandment not to boil a kid in its mother's milk? Or is this just a rule formulated by the rabbis? And if so, how did they come up with it? These kinds of questions and many besides are hibernating inside the statement of the Mishnah. How do we wake it up? How do we unzip this file? We have to understand that Rabbi Yehuda assumed that he was dealing with very intelligent people. First of all, everyone knew what he was talking about, more or less. The material was familiar to them for cultural reasons. It was part of their daily life. And secondly, they're willing to put in the work to apply themselves to this algorithmic business of unzipping these files. For 300 years after Rabbi Yehuda Nasi compressed his zip file, the most brilliant minds in Jerusalem, in Israel, and in Babylonia were busy unzipping these files. And we have to remember that we're talking here about the great-great-great-grandfathers of Einstein and Marx and Durkheim and Spinoza and Arendt and Strauss and Strauss. The list of these great-great-great ancestors also goes into the hundreds. Just to name some of the most prominent ones: Rav and Shmuel to begin with, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Rav Bar Kapra, Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, Bar Achava, Hillel ben Gamliel III, Yehuda II, Reish Lakish, Rav Yochanan, Rav Shmuel ben Nachman, Yitzchak Napcho, Rav of Shiloh, Rav Yosef, Rav Zera, Rav Nazi, Rav Yeshua. These luminaries, a small stadium full of Einsteins, are known as the Amoraim. And their great unzipped file, taking up 63 tractates and 6,200 pages, and what pages, is known as the Talmud. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. It was the last two Amoraim, Rav Ashi and Ravina, who put the whole thing together around the year 500. They compiled synopses of all the key discussions of the Amoraim, together with all the references to extra Mishnaic material, what are called Beraitot and Toseftot, that Rav Yehuda had left out, with all the arguments and problems and differences of opinion and internal contradictions and ratiocinations and logicizations and all the work that it took to unzip the Mishnah file. The word Talmud comes from the word limud, to learn. This is really the essence of Jewish literacy. Talmud Torah, the learning of the teaching. And by the way, we're only talking about the Babylonian Talmud here. You thought there was only one Talmud. About 200 years earlier, in the Holy Land, another group of gentlemen put together the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. There's just not enough hours in the day. The Jerusalem Talmud is a more tightly zipped file, and the rabbis of Jerusalem, in their disputes, were real gentlemen, unlike the rabbis of Babylon, who were known to be charif, piquant in their disputes, which is probably why the Babylonian Talmud won out in popularity. More action! Go! Babylonian, go! Woo! More nuance, more complexity, more depth. Oh, are you ready to see what a Talmud page looks like? This is no ordinary page, my friends. No, each one of these 6,200 pages is like a complex mosaic that needs its own room at the Smithsonian. Mosaic? Like Moses? Now here's what a page of Talmud actually looks like in its classical format since the 15th century. At the top of each page, we have the name of the tractate and of the chapter and the page number. At the center, we have the Talmud per se. This is composed of two parts. First, the Mishnah. This is the bare bones of the Talmud, as it were, the skeleton. And the flesh of the Talmud, what's known as the Gemara, begins where the Mishnah ends. Typically for each Mishnah, which is a short paragraph, you get a few pages of Gemara, and sometimes many, many pages of Gemara. The Mishnah is written in Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, a slightly later Hebrew than the biblical one. And the Gemara, the discussion among the Amoraim who quote the Tanaim, is written in a legal jargon mixing Hebrew and Aramaic. Aramaic being the lingua franca of the entire region since the establishment of the Babylonian Empire. On the inside of every page, we have the commentary of Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, 11th century commentator from northern France, who explains in very pithy language every little knotty point that we find inside the Gemara. On the outside of the page, we find the Tosafos. These are basically Rashi's grandchildren, literally and metaphorically. Literally, Rabbeinu Tam, the Rashbam, the Ri were sons of Rashi's daughters. But metaphorically, the Tosafists, who numbered in the hundreds, only 44 are known by name, are a school of brilliant commentators working between the 12th and 15th centuries, adding sophistication to Rashi's commentary. And by adding, we should also understand subtracting, because the Tosafists are often quite critical of Rashi, of Grandpa. But this is also a kind of adding, which is why they're called the Tosafists, the adders. And then we have some textual apparatus on the edges of the page. Rabbeinu Hananel, a contemporary of Rashi, the commentary of Rabbi Yoel Sirkish, a 7th century commentator, Rabbi Akiva Eger, an 18th century commentator, the Ein Mishpat, which is an index to the Jewish legal codes, Torah Or, which is a reference apparatus for biblical quotations, Masoros HaShas, which gives us parallel texts and cross-references to identical passages in other tractates. And these 6,500 pages aren't exactly light reading. If you can get through a page in an hour or two, which is what some people do on a daily basis, the Daf Yomi, the daily Talmudic page, that's pretty good. But even that's only a superficial reading. A really diligent, focused Talmudic scholar who spends the appropriate amount of time with a Talmudic page, moving along at cruising speed, will get through 4 pages a day. But that's an expert. Now, once the Talmud took shape around the year 500, a brief interlude of about a century or two saw the Savoraim, the reasoners. Some scholars believe that these men smoothed over the material of the Talmud and effectively acted as its final redactors. But in any case, very few works, independent works, exist from this period. But the period following that of the Geonim, of the splendorous ones, or the geniuses, there the pace picks up a bit. And it's a pretty long period, just under half a millennium. The Geonim wrote commentaries on the Torah and on the Talmud. They also wrote philosophical works, such as Sadia Gaon's groundbreaking Book of Beliefs and Opinions. And this was in their spare time. Their full-time job was to head the Talmudic academies of Babylon, primarily in Sura and Pumbedita, which were the two centers of learning at the time. What the period is especially known for is a type of literature known as tshuvot, responsa. These writings, like the word says, are responses, basically long letters, sometimes book length, written to people from all over the world who needed answers to various practical halachic questions. All kinds of interesting questions come up, such as whether debts may be collected from movable property, chattel, not just land, to which Rav Natroni Gaon wrote an affirmative response, whether local customs may be followed, To which Rav Hai Gaon responded, yes, so long as the local customs don't contradict the Talmud. Rav Sharira Gaon was asked by the Jews of Tunisia to explain the history and composition of the Mishnah and Talmud, to which he wrote a long epistle that remains a classic. Many such questions and answers were compiled into anthologies such as the Sheilot u'Tshuvot meHageonim, the Sha'arei Tzedek, Tshuvot HaGeonim, etc., etc., etc.